Meredith Finch had always believed that libraries were sanctuaries of quiet reason, places where the only drama came from overdue book fees and the occasional patron who insisted on eating tuna sandwiches near the reference desk. She had spent 8 blissful years as head librarian at the Millbrook Public Library, surrounded by the comforting predictability of the Dewey Decimal System and the gentle hum of fluorescent lights. Nothing could have prepared her for the Tuesday morning when she accidentally became a religious figure. It started, as most disasters do, with good intentions and poor judgment. "I just don't understand why my life feels so meaningless," Mrs. Henderson had sighed, clutching a well-worn copy of Chicken Soup for the Soul to her chest. She was one of the library's regular patrons, a widow in her 70s, who had recently taken to visiting daily since her children moved to Florida. "I wake up, I eat toast, I watch the news, I go to bed. There has to be more to existence than this." Meredith looked up from her computer terminal, where she had been updating catalog records with the enthusiasm of someone watching paint dry. Mrs. Henderson stood before the circulation desk with the desperate expression of someone seeking profound wisdom from a 29-year-old woman whose most spiritual moment of the week involved deciding between caffeinated and decaffeinated tea. "Well," Meredith said, adjusting her glasses and glancing around the nearly empty library, "have you considered that maybe everything has hidden meaning? Like, take this book." She gestured to the volume in Mrs. Henderson's hands. "It's classified as 158.1 in the Dewey Decimal System. That's not just a random number, you know. 1 represents unity and new beginnings. 5 represents change and freedom. 8 represents material success and achievement. Put them together, and maybe the universe is telling you that you're ready for a new beginning that will bring positive change and success to your life." The words tumbled out before Meredith could stop them, a sarcastic interpretation born from years of memorizing classification numbers, and a desperate desire to make Mrs. Henderson feel better so she could return to her cataloging. What she hadn't expected was the way Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened with wonder, as if Meredith had just handed her the keys to enlightenment. "My goodness," Mrs. Henderson whispered, staring at the book with newfound reverence. "I never thought about it that way. The numbers, they're like a message." "Oh, well, I was just—" Meredith began, but Mrs. Henderson was already backing away, clutching the book like a sacred relic. "Thank you, dear. This changes everything." Meredith watched her leave with a mixture of confusion and mild concern, then promptly forgot about the entire interaction until the following Tuesday, when Mrs. Henderson returned with 3 friends in tow. "This is her," Mrs. Henderson announced to the small group of middle-aged women who had gathered around the circulation desk like pilgrims at a shrine. "This is the young woman I told you about, the one who can read the sacred numbers." Meredith blinked slowly, processing the phrase "sacred numbers" with the same comprehension level as someone trying to understand quantum physics through interpretive dance. "I'm sorry, what now?" "Please," said a woman with carefully styled silver hair and a designer handbag, "could you tell us what the numbers mean for this book?" She held up a cookbook entitled Mastering French Cuisine, her hands trembling slightly with what appeared to be religious fervor. Meredith stared at the book, then at the expectant faces surrounding her. The rational part of her brain screamed that she should clarify the misunderstanding immediately. The socially anxious part of her brain, however, was terrified of disappointing these women who looked at her with such hope and desperation. She said, buying time by looking up the book's classification number, 641.5944. Well, 6 represents harmony and nurturing, 4 appears twice, which amplifies its meaning of stability and foundation, 1 represents new beginnings, 5 represents change, and 9 represents completion and wisdom. So, the universe might be telling you that you're ready to nurture yourself and others by building a stable foundation through new culinary adventures that will bring wisdom and completion to your life. The women exchanged glances that bordered on ecstatic. "Incredible," whispered the silver-haired woman. "I've been thinking about taking cooking classes, but I wasn't sure if it was the right time. The numbers have spoken." Within 2 weeks, what Meredith had dubbed in her own mind as the Tuesday incident had evolved into something far more complex and terrifying. Word spread through Millbrook's tight-knit community with the efficiency of a small-town scandal. Soon, Meredith found herself facing crowds of people every Tuesday afternoon, all seeking guidance from what they had begun calling the Dewey Decimal Oracle. The situation reached critical mass when Harold Pemberton, a retired insurance adjuster with a passion for conspiracy theories and too much time on his hands, declared that Meredith had unlocked, quote, the ancient wisdom hidden in plain sight by the founding fathers of the library system. Think about it, Harold proclaimed to anyone who would listen. Melville Dewey created his system in 1876. That's not a coincidence. 1876 adds up to 22, which is a master number in numerology. The man was clearly receiving divine inspiration. Meredith tried to explain that Dewey had simply wanted to organize books more efficiently, but Harold dismissed this as exactly what someone who had discovered cosmic truth would want people to think. By the fourth Tuesday, the group had grown to include Mrs. Patterson from the post office, Bob the pharmacist, 3 retired teachers, a handful of housewives, and surprisingly, Dr. Martinez from the medical center, who claimed that the numbers had guided him to a breakthrough in treating Mrs. Kowalski's chronic back pain. The fact that Mrs. Kowalski had actually been helped by a new prescription rather than mystical numerical guidance seemed irrelevant to everyone except Meredith. The breaking point came when someone suggested they needed a proper meeting space, and Harold volunteered his finished basement. Suddenly, Meredith found herself standing in a wood-paneled room filled with folding chairs, facing 23 expectant faces, while a hand-painted banner reading "The Order of Sacred Decimals" hung behind her. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Meredith began, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm not actually a spiritual leader. I'm just a librarian who happened to make a joke about classification numbers." "Humility," Harold nodded sagely. "A true sign of enlightenment." "No, really, I was being sarcastic. The Dewey Decimal System is just a way to organize books. There's nothing mystical about it." "Of course you have to say that," Mrs. Henderson said kindly. "The sacred knowledge must be protected from those who aren't ready to receive it." Meredith felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole, except instead of Wonderland, she had fallen into a parallel universe where library science had become a religion, and she was somehow the high priestess. The situation grew increasingly surreal over the following weeks. Harold created a website called decimaldivinity.com, where he posted transcripts of Meredith's teachings, which were actually just her desperate attempts to explain basic library organization principles. Mrs. Patterson started a newsletter called The Dewey Daily, featuring inspirational number interpretations that she claimed came directly from Meredith, despite the fact that Meredith had never spoken to her privately. Most disturbing of all, people began making significant life decisions based on what they believed to be her guidance. Bob the pharmacist quit his job to become a professional dog walker after Meredith offhandedly mentioned that his blood pressure medication was classified under 615.711, which apparently meant he was destined for a career involving loyal companions and outdoor exercise. Mrs. Patterson's daughter drove up from Sacramento to confront her mother about joining what she called some weird book cult. Meredith tried everything she could think of to disband the group. She attempted to give a presentation on the actual history of the Dewey Decimal System, complete with slides and handouts, but her followers interpreted it as a deeper layer of mystical teaching. She tried being deliberately boring, spending an entire meeting explaining the differences between various cataloging standards, but Harold declared it a meditation on the beauty of organizational harmony. In desperation, she even tried confessing that she had made everything up, but Mrs. Henderson patted her hand sympathetically and said, "Of course you feel like a fraud, dear. All great spiritual leaders go through periods of doubt." The final straw came on a rainy Thursday evening in November, when Meredith arrived at the library to find a news van parked outside. A perfectly coiffed reporter was interviewing Harold under an umbrella, while a cameraman captured what Harold was describing as the sacred halls where the Oracle first received her divine download. "We're here with Harold Pemberton," the reporter was saying, founder of what some are calling the fastest-growing religious movement in Northern California. "Harold, tell us about this Dewey Decimal divination that's captured the attention of so many people." Meredith stood frozen in the rain, watching her quiet, predictable life transform into a media circus. This was exactly the kind of attention she had spent her entire adult life trying to avoid. She could see tomorrow's headlines. Local librarian accidentally starts religion based on book organization system. Her mother would have a heart attack. Her graduate school professors would revoke her degree out of sheer embarrassment. That night, Meredith sat in her small apartment, surrounded by towers of books, trying to figure out how to extract herself from the situation without crushing the spirits of people who genuinely seemed to find comfort in their bizarre interpretation of library science. These weren't bad people. They were lonely, searching for meaning, desperate for something to believe in. She couldn't just abandon them, but she also couldn't continue living as the reluctant messiah of the card catalog. The solution came to her at 3 a.m. while she was stress-eating cereal and reading a book about crisis management that she had borrowed from her own library's 658.4 section. If she couldn't convince them that the whole thing was nonsense, maybe she could gradually transition them towards something healthier. The next Tuesday, Meredith stood before her followers with a new plan. "I've been receiving some new guidance," she announced, ignoring the way her voice shook. "The numbers are telling me that our group needs to evolve. The sacred knowledge of the Dewey Decimal System has served its purpose in bringing us together, but now we're being called to a higher level of service." 23 pairs of eyes stared at her with rapt attention. "The numbers 361.7 keep appearing in my meditations," she continued, silently apologizing to Melville Dewey for what she was about to do to his legacy. "That's the classification for volunteer service and community support. I believe we're being called to put our spiritual understanding into action by helping others." Harold raised his hand. "What kind of action?" "Well," Meredith said, warming to her theme. "Mrs. Henderson, remember how the numbers told you that you were ready for new beginnings? Maybe that beginning is volunteering at the senior center, sharing your wisdom with others who might be feeling lost." Mrs. Henderson's face lit up. "That makes perfect sense. I've been feeling called to help others." "And Bob," Meredith continued, "your career change was guided by numbers about loyal companions. Perhaps you could volunteer at the animal shelter, helping to care for animals who need homes." Bob nodded enthusiastically. "I was already thinking about that." Over the following months, Meredith carefully orchestrated the transformation of the Order of Sacred Decimals from a quasi-religious movement into something resembling a volunteer service organization. She created number-guided volunteer opportunities that matched people's actual interests and skills. Harold, with his love of research and organization, became a volunteer coordinator for the local food bank. Dr. Martinez started a free clinic for uninsured residents. The retired teachers began tutoring programs for struggling students. Gradually, the focus shifted from mystical number interpretation to practical community service. People still talked about being guided by the sacred decimals, but they were too busy helping others to spend much time analyzing classification numbers. The Tuesday meetings evolved into volunteer coordination sessions, with Meredith serving as more of a project manager than a spiritual guru. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Harold initially resisted the change, insisting that they were abandoning the pure teachings for worldly concerns. But when his food bank work led to a romance with Ellen, a fellow volunteer who shared his passion for conspiracy theories and home canning, he decided that the numbers had clearly guided him toward his true purpose. By spring, the local newspaper was running a different kind of story about the group. Local volunteers transform community through service. There was no mention of Dewey Decimal divination or sacred numbers, just a straightforward article about citizens making a difference in their community. Meredith found herself genuinely proud of what the group had accomplished, even if the foundation had been built on her panicked improvisation and their collective misunderstanding of library science. They had created something good from something absurd, and perhaps that was worth the months of anxiety and awkwardness she had endured. The final meeting of the Order of Sacred Decimals took place on a warm Tuesday evening in June. Only 12 people showed up, the others being too busy with their various volunteer commitments to attend regular meetings. "I think it's time," Meredith announced, "for us to acknowledge that we've outgrown our original purpose. You don't need me to interpret numbers for you anymore. You've all found your own paths to meaning and service." Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. "Does this mean you won't be our spiritual leader anymore?" "I was never really your spiritual leader," Meredith said gently. "I was just a librarian who happened to say something at the right moment when you needed to hear it. But look what you've all accomplished. Mrs. Henderson, you've organized a support group for widows that serves 3 counties. Bob, your work with animal rescue has saved dozens of lives. Harold, your food distribution program has helped hundreds of families. You did all of that yourselves." "But the numbers," Harold began. "The numbers were just a way for you to give yourselves permission to do what you already wanted to do," Meredith said. "You didn't need mystical guidance. You needed confidence and community, and you found both." There was a long silence as the group absorbed this. "So what happens now?" asked Dr. Martinez. "Now you keep doing the good work you're doing, and I go back to being a regular librarian," Meredith said. "Though I hope you'll still visit the library. We have some excellent books on volunteer management in the 361 section." 6 months later, Meredith was back to her quiet routine of cataloging books and helping patrons find information. The library was peaceful again, filled with the familiar sounds of turning pages and clicking keyboards, rather than the fervent whispers of spiritual seekers. She was updating records on a Tuesday afternoon when Mrs. Henderson approached the circulation desk with a familiar expression of uncertainty. "Meredith, dear," she said, holding up a book about gardening, I've been thinking about starting a community garden, but I'm not sure if it's the right time. Could you tell me what you think?" Meredith looked at the book, then at Mrs. Henderson's hopeful face. For a moment, she was tempted to glance at the classification number and offer some invented interpretation. Instead, she smiled and said, "I think if you're passionate about it and willing to put in the work, it sounds like a wonderful idea. Have you talked to the city about available land?" Mrs. Henderson's face broke into a grin. "You know what? I think I'll do that tomorrow. Thank you, dear." As she watched Mrs. Henderson walk away with purpose and determination, Meredith reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all to this point. She had accidentally created a cult based on library science, transformed it into a volunteer organization, and somehow helped a group of lonely people find meaning and community in their lives. It wasn't the quiet, predictable career she had planned, but it had certainly been memorable. She turned back to her computer and continued updating catalog records, secure in the knowledge that the Dewey Decimal System would remain exactly what Melville Dewey had intended: a practical method for organizing books, not a gateway to spiritual enlightenment. Though she had to admit 001.942, the classification for unexplained phenomena, seemed oddly appropriate for what had happened to her life over the past year. She shook her head and smiled, then got back to work. After all, those books weren't going to catalog themselves, and she had learned that even the most ordinary job could lead to extraordinary adventures if you weren't careful with your sarcasm around lonely widows. In the months that followed, the former members of the Order of Sacred Decimals continued their volunteer work throughout the community. Harold and Ellen got married in a small ceremony at the food bank, with decorations that Harold insisted represented the sacred geometry of canned goods distribution. Bob opened his own dog rescue organization, and Dr. Martinez's free clinic became a permanent fixture in the community health network. Meredith occasionally ran into them at the library or around town, and they always greeted her with warmth and gratitude. They had moved beyond their need for mystical number interpretations, but they hadn't forgotten the sense of purpose and community they had found during those strange months when they believed that library classification numbers held the secrets of the universe. Sometimes, late at night when she was closing the library, Meredith would walk through the stacks and marvel at the thousands of books surrounding her, each one marked with its own Dewey Decimal number. She would think about all the knowledge and stories contained within those covers, all the lives that had been touched by the simple act of organizing information in a logical, accessible way. Maybe Harold had been right about one thing. There was something magical about libraries, even if it had nothing to do with divine decimal revelations. It was the magic of human connection, of communities coming together around shared resources and common goals, of quiet spaces where people could discover new ideas and possibilities. And if occasionally someone found spiritual meaning in the process, well, stranger things had happened in the history of human belief systems. Meredith locked up the library, turned off the lights, and headed home to her quiet apartment, content in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another day of helping people find the information they needed, whether it was the location of a cookbook or the deeper meaning of life itself. Though she made a mental note to be more careful about making sarcastic comments to vulnerable patrons in the future. She had learned that words had power, even when spoken by someone who just wanted to get back to updating catalog records in peace.